Fire over Leyte. The birth of a new kind of war. By October of 1944, the skies over the Philippines had become a furnace. American invasion forces were pouring into Leyte Gulf, determined to drive Japan out of the South Pacific once and for all. Every day, hundreds of planes clashed in the air. Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers, and the last of Japan's legendary Zeros. But something was changing. The Japanese pilots weren't fighting like before. They were diving straight into anti-aircraft fire, ignoring the defensive formations and refusing to pull up even as tracer rounds tore through their wings. At first, the Americans thought they were witnessing bad flying. Desperation, maybe. They weren't. What they were seeing was the beginning of a new kind of weapon, a weapon that turned the human body into the bomb. On the morning of October 25th, a lone Zero dropped out of the clouds above the USS St. Lo. The gunners opened fire immediately, short bursts, then sustained volleys. But the plane didn't flinch. It came in low, leveled out just long enough to aim its 500-pound bomb, and then disappeared into the carrier's deck in a blinding flash of light. The St. Lo burned for 20 minutes before exploding. 143 men were lost. The world would later learn the pilot's name. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, commander of Japan's 1st Tokutai unit, the so-called Special Attack Corps. For centuries, the samurai ideal had glorified death before dishonor. But now, Japan's military was rewriting that code, turning it into state doctrine, weaponizing it in the sky. And with that dive, Lieutenant Seki didn't just destroy a ship. He signaled the death of the Zero's golden age and the birth of something far darker. The broken sword. Japan's desperate gamble. By late 1944, Japan's Air Force was a shadow of its former self. The once feared Imperial Navy had lost hundreds of planes at the Marianas, and the factories back home could no longer replace them fast enough. Aviation fuel was running out, pilots were barely trained, and the Zero, the pride of Japan's skies, had become an outdated relic in a modern war. In the early years of the conflict, the Zero had dominated. It was fast, nimble, and deadly in the hands of Japan's elite aviators. But by 1944, the tables had turned. The Americans had learned its weaknesses: thin armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and a limited dive speed. Against Hellcats and Corsairs, the Zero had become little more than a flying target. Japan's military leadership knew it. They had watched their carriers sink one after another, their supply lines crumble, and their airfields turn to ashes under American bombing raids. But instead of surrendering, they turned to something far darker, a weapon born not of strategy, but of despair. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, proposed an idea that stunned even his fellow officers. What if Japan's remaining pilots were asked not to fight, but to die? Onishi believed that a single pilot, sacrificing himself with precision and purpose, could do what squadrons could no longer accomplish: sink American warships through sheer willpower. It was a horrifyingly logical conclusion for a nation that had elevated the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, into a spiritual code of national identity. Thus, the Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the special attack units, were born. The young men chosen for this new corps were not all volunteers, as the propaganda claimed. Many were pressured, coerced, or quietly assigned without being told their true mission until the final hours. They were told their sacrifice would save the emperor and the nation, that their deaths would light the path to victory. Their planes were stripped of unnecessary weight, loaded with massive bombs, and blessed in ritual ceremonies. Before each mission, they were given a headband, the hachimaki, symbolizing courage and purity. Some left behind farewell letters. Others sat quietly, staring into the dawn. When they launched from airstrips in Luzon, Okinawa, or Kyushu, they knew they would never return. To the Americans, it was a new kind of terror. Radar screens would light up, and every unidentified blip could be a suicide plane. Destroyers would scramble their gunners, screaming targets across the deck as a dot appeared on the horizon. Low, fast, and unstoppable. In that instant, the Pacific changed forever. This was no longer a war of attrition. It was a war of willpower, and Japan had weaponized death itself. Baptism by fire. The Kamikazes' first wave. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had already been raging for days when Japan's first air fleet made its final move. October 25th, 1944. Dawn broke over a sea littered with burning wrecks. American carriers, cruisers, and destroyers filled the horizon, their decks stained with smoke and oil. Above them, the sky shimmered with the rising heat of war. That morning, 24 Japanese aircraft lifted off from Mabalacat Airfield on Luzon. Each one carried a 500-pound bomb bolted beneath the fuselage. At the head of the formation flew Lieutenant Yukio Seki, 23 years old, calm and composed. A veteran pilot, he had once dreamed of teaching Japan's next generation of aviators. Now, he led them to die. At approximately 10:45 a.m., Seki's unit, the Shikishima Squadron, sighted Task Unit 77.4.3, known to the sailors as Taffy 3. It was a group of small escort carriers and destroyers providing air support for the invasion at Leyte. The Americans saw the planes first, tiny black dots descending from the clouds. Bandits inbound, bearing 010. The alarm echoed across the decks of the USS St. Lo, the USS Kitkun Bay, and the USS Fanshawe Bay. Anti-aircraft gunners raced to their stations. The sound of 50 caliber machine guns filled the air. The first wave came screaming in from the sun. Tracer rounds stitched across the sky, tearing into wings and engines. But the planes didn't break off. They kept coming. 10 plunged straight into the sea beside the St. Lo, exploding in a column of water that drenched the deck. Another clipped the carrier's island structure, scattering flaming debris across the flight deck. Then came Seki. Witnesses later recalled seeing his plane, a silver flash with the rising sun painted on its wings, dive directly toward the carrier's stern. It leveled for a heartbeat, almost as if saluting the target, then slammed into the deck with a roar that shook the sea itself. The explosion ripped open the ship's hangar bay, detonating torpedoes and aviation fuel. 20 minutes later, the USS St. Lo vanished beneath the waves, the first major warship in history to be sunk by a suicide attack. For the Americans, it was incomprehensible. Sailors stood frozen, watching in disbelief as Japanese planes deliberately hurled themselves into the fleet. Veterans who had fought in the Solomons and the Coral Sea said they'd never seen anything like it. At first, some thought it was coincidence, damaged planes crashing out of control. But the pattern repeated. Hours later, 4 more carriers, the Kitkun Bay, Kalinin Bay, White Plains, and Fanshawe Bay, were hit in similar fashion. The damage was catastrophic. Nearly 400 men were killed in a single day. And yet, for all its horror, the tactic was effective. Even the U.S. Navy's vast industrial power couldn't protect every ship from a weapon that refused to retreat. In Tokyo, word of the success spread like wildfire. Posters proclaimed the Kamikaze as divine wind reborn, a modern echo of the storm that had once destroyed Kublai Khan's invasion fleet centuries earlier. The newspapers hailed Seki and his men as gods. But privately, Seki's surviving comrades would tell a different story. He had confided, before takeoff, that he did not believe in victory, that this plan would waste Japan's finest youth for nothing. Still, he flew, because in Japan's twisted new logic, to refuse would be a greater sin than to die. The Americans recovered quickly. They tightened their formations, improved radar coordination, and placed destroyers ahead as pickets, floating shields to absorb incoming attacks. But the psychological toll was immense. Every alarm, every radar blip, every glint of sunlight could trigger panic. The skies over Leyte had become a killing ground, where courage was no longer measured in survival, but in how long one could stand before the next dive. And for Japan, this was only the beginning. Wings of the Divine Wind. The expansion of the Kamikaze campaign, Okinawa, 1945. In the months after Leyte, Japan's military command became consumed by the idea of the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Units. The name Shinpu, meaning divine wind, was chosen deliberately. It evoked the ancient storm that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century, a national myth now reborn as military prophecy. To the high command, the kamikaze was not just a tactic. It was faith made into strategy. By early 1945, American forces had seized control of Luzon and Iwo Jima. The next target was Okinawa, the last major stepping stone before Japan itself. The Imperial Navy was crippled, the Air Force scattered, and Japan's cities were burning under relentless B-29 bombing raids. Yet Tokyo's war councils clung to a single hope: that mass suicide attacks could inflict such staggering losses that the United States might hesitate to invade the home islands. In March of 1945, Japan unleashed Operation Tengo, the largest suicide offensive in history. Over 1,500 aircraft were assigned to attack the American invasion fleet off Okinawa. They came in waves, sometimes a dozen at a time, sometimes hundreds, diving through smoke, rain, and anti-aircraft fire in a spectacle so horrifying that even hardened combat veterans described it as apocalyptic. Every kind of aircraft Japan could spare was used. Old trainers, decaying bombers, modified fighters with stripped-out guns. Even twin-engine Betty bombers were loaded with explosives and flown directly into the enemy fleet. Among the most feared weapons was the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a small manned rocket-propelled glider nicknamed the Baka bomb by U.S. forces. The word baka meant fool in Japanese, a grim joke for a weapon that offered its pilot no chance of return. Carried beneath a bomber and released miles from the target, the Oka could reach speeds over 600 miles per hour during its final dive. When it hit, there was nothing left but vapor. American radar operators learned to recognize the signs: a Betty bomber on approach, then a sudden blip vanishing as the Oka was released. Moments later, a streak of white fire would appear against the clouds, heading straight for a ship's silhouette. At Okinawa, those blips became a daily reality. Between April and June of 1945, over 1,900 kamikaze sorties were launched. More than 300 Allied vessels were damaged or sunk. The destroyers Laffey, Bush, and Newcomb were hit repeatedly, their decks turned into infernos. The USS Bunker Hill, struck by 2 kamikazes in quick succession, lost nearly 400 crewmen in a single morning. The attacks were devastating, but also futile. Each success came at the cost of irreplaceable pilots, planes, and fuel. And with every wave destroyed, Japan's airfields grew emptier. What had once been a proud air armada was now little more than a suicide cult. Still, for those who flew, the conviction was real. Surviving diaries recovered after the war reveal a haunting mix of patriotism, confusion, and sorrow. Some pilots wrote that they were proud to die for the emperor. Others confessed that they longed to live, but could not bear the shame of refusal. In their final hours, they wrote poems, drank ceremonial sake, and wept quietly with their comrades. To the Americans, each attack carried its own nightmare rhythm. Radar blip, alarm bell, engines roaring to full power. Then the desperate wait. Would the next explosion be near or on deck? For the Japanese command, it was proof that Japan's spirit had not yet surrendered. For the men dying in the cockpits, it was proof that it already had. The Empire's dying breath, the last Kamikazes, and Japan's final stand. Summer 1945. By the summer of 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing in slow motion. Its once mighty navy lay rusting in shallow harbors. Its factories had been reduced to ash. And in the skies over the homeland, the drone of American bombers had become as familiar as thunder. Yet the orders still came. Prepare the next wave. The Kamikaze Corps, now spread across Kyushu, Honshu, and Okinawa, was a shadow of what it once claimed to be. The skilled aviators were gone, replaced by boys barely old enough to shave, trained for days instead of months, taught not to fight, but to die. Some had never flown solo before their final mission. Gasoline was so scarce that training flights were often conducted in gliders, with instructors shouting from the ground. Engines were reserved only for the last takeoff, the one that mattered. American forces, meanwhile, had grown too powerful to stop. Carrier groups ringed Japan's coastline. Every airfield, every shipyard, every railway was under surveillance or bombardment. But still, each morning, a handful of Japanese planes would rise into the gray sky, engines sputtering, wings patched with tin, to make one last desperate charge toward the sea. By then, even the Kamikaze command knew the truth. The attacks no longer slowed the American advance. Each dive was a flicker in the storm, tragic, brief, and utterly consumed. But for a regime built on the illusion of honor, to stop would mean admitting defeat. So they kept sending them, waves of young men with painted headbands, smiles fixed for the camera, tears hidden behind clenched jaws. They were told that the emperor was watching, that their families would remember them forever. In reality, many families never even learned where their sons had died. One of the last major kamikaze attacks came in July 1945, when a formation of 8 planes launched from southern Kyushu toward the U.S. fleet off Okinawa. Only one reached its target, a destroyer escort named Callahan. The Zero struck near the aft gun mount, detonating its bomb deep inside the ship's hull. In less than 5 minutes, the Callahan rolled and sank. 87 men were lost. It would be the final U.S. warship sunk by a suicide plane in World War II. The next day, another formation attempted to follow, but American fighters intercepted them before they reached open water. Not one made it through. By August, the sky itself seemed to rebel. Massive mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities erased in seconds. The fire Japan had once unleashed upon others now returned home with divine fury. And with it, the divine wind was gone. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, thousands of kamikaze volunteers were still waiting for their missions. Some wept in relief. Others refused to believe it. A few took off anyway, ignoring orders, flying into the sea rather than face the shame of living. In the ruins that followed, the survivors of the Tokotai would live quietly, many refusing to speak of what they'd done for decades. Historians would later argue whether the Kamikaze campaign was bravery, madness, or manipulation. But for those who witnessed it, on both sides, it was something beyond words. A chapter where the limits of courage, desperation, and humanity all collided in the sky. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese mastery, had become a coffin for the men who flew it. And with its final dive, the age of the warrior gave way to the age of the machine. Echoes of the divine wind, legacy, memory, and the human cost. When the guns finally fell silent, Japan was a nation standing in ruins, not just of concrete and steel, but of spirit. Its cities were flattened, its emperor's divinity dissolved, its people starving. But among the ashes, one memory burned brighter than any other. The men who had taken to the sky, never to return. In the immediate years after surrender, the word kamikaze was almost forbidden. It carried shame, pride, and pain all at once. To the victors, it symbolized fanaticism. To the survivors, it symbolized loss. And to Japan itself, it symbolized a question that would haunt generations. What does it mean to die for your country? And what does it mean to live afterward? Across Japan, small wooden shrines appeared, built quietly by families who had lost sons. They placed framed photographs, flight badges, and folded headbands before altars. Some left untouched cups of sake that would never be drunk. Others wrote names on paper slips and burned them at dawn, offerings to a sky that had swallowed their children whole. At Chiren, on the southern tip of Kyushu, the airfield from which hundreds of kamikaze had departed became sacred ground. There, the Chiran Peace Museum for kamikaze pilots would one day stand. Its walls are lined with thousands of faces, young, solemn, determined, their final letters preserved behind glass. In one, a 19-year-old wrote simply, "Mother, I will go ahead." In another, a 22-year-old begged forgiveness for bringing shame by dying so soon. Visitors who walk those halls today speak in whispers, because to stand among those faces is to feel something that statistics can't explain. Not politics, not strategy, but the sheer gravity of human conviction harnessed and destroyed by war. For decades, Japan avoided open discussion of the kamikaze. Post-war textbooks skipped over it with a paragraph. Veterans who survived often lived in silence, unwilling to be called heroes or traitors. Only in the 1970s did some begin to speak, describing the contradictions of loyalty and fear, the moments before takeoff when their hands trembled on the throttle. One pilot recalled how, moments before his mission, the base loudspeakers played a song titled, "If I Go to Sea." He said, "That melody still follows me every night." In the West, the image of the kamikaze became legend, a shorthand for hopeless defiance, for courage warped by ideology. But within Japan, the story was never so simple. For many, those men were victims, not of cowardice, but of obedience. They were raised to believe that death could redeem a nation that was already lost. And so they obeyed, not because they wanted to die, but because no one told them they were allowed to live. Today, the term kamikaze still echoes beyond the war. It appears in films, books, even video games, often stripped of its sorrow, used as a symbol of reckless courage. Yet beneath every modern retelling lies the same truth. That war, in its most desperate moments, turns ordinary people into instruments of fate. Historians now see the kamikaze not as a military tactic, but as a mirror held up to humanity itself. They remind us how belief can be twisted into obedience, how devotion can become destruction, and how easily courage can be exploited when a nation confuses sacrifice with salvation. For Japan, the divine wind that once promised protection instead became a storm that swept away its youth. For the world, it became a lesson, one written not in victory or defeat, but in the faces of the men who vanished into the sea. Their planes are gone, their runways are silent, but the echoes remain, in the letters, the memorials, and the quiet question that lingers whenever humanity sends its sons to die in the name of honor. Was it worth it? From ashes to silence, Japan's rebirth and the legacy of the sky. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, its skies went quiet. The once endless roar of engines, Zeros, Betty bombers, Vals, faded into memory. For the first time in years, the horizon was empty. The pilots who remained watched the sunrise over a nation that no longer asked them to die. In the months that followed, occupation forces dismantled what was left of Japan's war machine. Airfields became farmland. Aircraft factories were stripped for parts. The last surviving Zeros were bulldozed into pits or pushed off cliffs into the sea. For a generation that had defined itself through flight, it was like erasing the sun. But out of that silence came something remarkable. Japan did not rebuild its air power first. It rebuilt its conscience. Under a new constitution, Article 9 declared that the nation would never again wage war as a means of settling disputes. It was a radical transformation. The same country that once turned men into weapons now swore to defend peace, even at the cost of pride. And yet, even in peace, the memory of the Kamikaze lingered. Every year at Chiran, families and former soldiers gather beneath the cherry blossoms. They lay flowers, light incense, and read the names of the fallen aloud. Not as heroes, not as villains, but as sons, brothers, and friends. Human beings caught in a moment where honor and despair became indistinguishable. In time, Japan's skies would fill again. The self-defense force would take shape. Pilots once more flying under the rising sun, but with a different purpose. Where their grandfathers had been trained to crash, these new aviators were trained to protect. And every time a jet rolls down the runway, the past rides silently behind it, a reminder of how easily a nation's ideals can be twisted into tragedy. The Kamikaze story doesn't end with war. It ends in reflection, in the understanding that courage, once detached from reason, becomes destruction. That love for one's country means more than obedience. It means the will to preserve life, not to surrender it. In the end, the divine wind that once sought to save Japan nearly destroyed it. But from its ashes rose a nation that learned, finally, that true strength isn't in dying for a flag. It's in having the courage to never repeat the reasons to die for it again. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.